Rock Hill, South Carolina, a quiet town where crime was rare. The Cope family lived in a modest home, where Billy Wayne Cope, a devoted father, raised his 3 daughters, Amanda, 12, and her 2 younger sisters. The family dynamic had changed drastically after the sudden passing of Billy's wife, who had died of a heart condition just a few years earlier. Now, as a single father, Billy was solely responsible for his daughters. Despite financial struggles, he was known as a deeply religious man who attended church regularly and did his best to provide a stable environment for his children. But on the morning of November 29, 2001, that stability was shattered. Around 6:15 a.m., a frantic 911 call came from the Cope residence. Billy's voice trembled as he told the dispatcher that something was wrong with his daughter, Amanda. His words were disjointed, his breathing heavy. He said Amanda was cold, not breathing, and unresponsive in her bed. The operator tried to guide him through CPR, but Billy sounded overwhelmed. Emergency responders arrived quickly. They found Billy Cope in a panic, pointing towards Amanda's room. When paramedics entered, they discovered a devastating scene. Amanda was lifeless, lying in her bed. She had injuries that raised immediate suspicion. Her face was bruised, and there were clear signs that she had been strangled. It didn't take long for first responders to realize this wasn't a natural death. Something terrible had happened. Law enforcement arrived soon after, securing the house as a crime scene. Investigators started questioning Billy almost immediately. His emotional state stood out to them, not just because he was distressed, but because his behavior didn't match their expectations. He seemed disoriented, unable to give clear answers about what had happened the night before. Officers took note of his reactions, and some began to suspect that he wasn't just a grieving father. He might be hiding something. As Amanda's autopsy was performed later that day, forensic evidence confirmed the worst. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The brutality of the crime suggested a deeply personal attack, leading investigators to focus their attention on the person closest to her, her father, Billy Cope. That same night, detectives took Billy in for questioning. They told him Amanda's death was not an accident. They asked him to explain how someone could have entered the house without him noticing. They pressed him on inconsistencies in his 911 call. But Billy kept insisting that he had no idea what had happened. As the hours dragged on, the interrogation intensified. Law enforcement wasn't just gathering information, they were building a case. By the time Billy Cope left the police station, it was clear that investigators had already made up their minds. In their eyes, he wasn't just a witness. He was the prime suspect. But there was a major problem. At that moment, they had no physical evidence connecting him to the crime. No DNA, no fingerprints, just a grieving father and a growing suspicion. And then, something happened that would change the course of the entire case. A DNA test revealed that Amanda's killer was someone else entirely. This revelation should have shifted the investigation in a new direction. But instead, it only deepened the mystery and raised troubling questions about the way this case was being handled. As investigators worked through the crime scene and evidence, the case against Billy Cope seemed strong, at least at first. The initial assumption was clear. Amanda had been murdered inside her home, and since there were no signs of forced entry, police believed the person responsible had to be someone from within the household. With Billy as the only adult in the home, their focus remained locked on him. But then, forensic results came back, and they changed everything. The DNA evidence found at the crime scene did not belong to Billy Cope. Instead, it matched an entirely different person, James Edward Saunders, a convicted sex offender with a disturbing history. This should have immediately altered the course of the investigation, shifting focus away from Billy and onto Saunders. But instead of clearing Billy, authorities decided to take the case in a new and highly controversial direction. Investigators now claimed that Billy Cope and James Saunders had worked together, that Billy had either allowed or arranged for Saunders to enter the home and assault Amanda. The prosecution's argument was that Billy wasn't just involved. He was an accomplice to his daughter's murder. This theory was highly unusual, but it served a critical purpose. If the state dropped charges against Billy, it would mean they had wrongfully accused him. It would mean they had aggressively pursued the wrong person for Amanda's murder despite clear evidence to the contrary. Instead of admitting that mistake, they built an entirely new case, one that implicated Billy alongside the real perpetrator. Detectives returned to the hours-long interrogation they had conducted with Billy just after Amanda's death. He had been subjected to an exhausting questioning process, one that had lasted over 10 hours. During that time, investigators repeatedly told him that Amanda's death was not an accident, that he was the only possible suspect, and that they had already decided he was guilty. Under the psychological pressure of the interrogation, Billy eventually gave a series of inconsistent statements, not outright confessions, but phrases that could be interpreted as admissions of guilt. Law enforcement used those statements to build their case. They argued that while Billy had initially denied involvement, he had later made remarks that, according to them, indicated guilt. But without forensic evidence tying Billy to the crime, their case relied almost entirely on these questionable statements and the idea that Billy must have collaborated with Saunders. Meanwhile, James Saunders was arrested and charged separately. His DNA had been found on Amanda's body, and his criminal past included prior sex offenses. There was no doubt that he had entered the Cope home and assaulted Amanda, but the prosecution refused to separate his crime from Billy's alleged involvement. Instead, they pushed forward with the theory that Billy had enabled the attack. The decision to pursue both men as co-conspirators meant Billy now faced the same severe charges as Saunders. Instead of being exonerated by the DNA evidence, he was now accused of working alongside a known predator to commit one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. Billy Cope, a grieving father who had lost his daughter in the worst way possible, now found himself preparing for a trial that would determine the rest of his life. And as the trial date approached, the case against him only became more shocking and controversial. As Billy Cope and James Edward Saunders prepared to face trial, the case took an even more disturbing turn. The prosecution was determined to convince the jury that Billy was not just a grieving father, but a man who had conspired in his own daughter's murder. Despite clear DNA evidence linking only Saunders to the crime, Billy was still facing the same life-altering charges. The courtroom was packed when the trial finally began. Prosecutors laid out their theory, arguing that Billy had somehow facilitated Amanda's assault and murder. They claimed that he had either allowed Saunders into the home or had a prior connection to him that explained why the crime had taken place without forced entry. The defense team, on the other hand, was facing an uphill battle. Their argument was simple: Billy was innocent. He had no connection to James Saunders, no knowledge of his presence in the home, and no involvement in the attack on Amanda. His only crime was being the first person to find her body and call 911. But the prosecution used Billy's interrogation against him. They played clips of his interviews, highlighting moments where his statements seemed to shift over the hours of questioning. They argued that he had given inconsistent responses about the sequence of events on the morning of Amanda's death. The defense fought back, explaining that Billy had been interrogated for over 10 hours on the same day he discovered his daughter's body. He was in a state of shock and deep emotional distress. Any minor inconsistencies in his statements, they argued, were the result of exhaustion and grief, not guilt. Then came the most critical evidence, the DNA. The forensic testing had already confirmed that only James Saunders' DNA was found on Amanda's body and at the crime scene. There was no physical evidence linking Billy to the assault or the murder. But instead of clearing him, the prosecution twisted the DNA results into a new argument. They told the jury that Billy may not have physically committed the crime, but he had allowed it to happen. They claimed he had orchestrated the attack by giving Saunders access to Amanda. The jury sat in silence, listening to both sides present their cases. The evidence against Saunders was overwhelming. His DNA was everywhere, his criminal past was well documented, and he had a clear pattern of predatory behavior. But for Billy, the case was built almost entirely on theory, on speculation, interrogation clips, and the idea that he was involved because there was no forced entry. The defense called character witnesses, including neighbors and family members who described Billy as a devoted father. They spoke of how much Amanda meant to him, how protective he had always been, and how there was no history of violence, abuse, or criminal activity in his past. But the prosecution countered with something powerful, the sheer emotion of the crime itself. They emphasized the horrific nature of Amanda's death, painting a picture of betrayal and darkness inside the Cope household. By the time closing arguments began, the jury was left with two very different interpretations of the case. Was Billy Cope a grieving father caught in a nightmare? Or was he a man who had secretly conspired with a predator to harm his own daughter? As the jury left the courtroom to deliberate, Billy Cope's entire future hung in the balance. As the jury deliberated, the courtroom remained tense. Billy Cope's fate rested on their decision, and despite the overwhelming forensic evidence pointing solely to James Edward Saunders, the prosecution's arguments had planted a seed of doubt. The question was whether that doubt would be enough to convict a grieving father of a crime he swore he didn't commit. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the judge asked for the verdict. When the foreperson stood and spoke, the words sent a shockwave through the room. Billy Wayne Cope was found guilty of his daughter Amanda Cope's murder. Gasps spread throughout the courtroom. Billy sat motionless, his face unreadable. His defense attorneys looked stunned, while prosecutors remained firm in their stance. The same jury then delivered a second guilty verdict, one for James Saunders, the man whose DNA was the only biological evidence found at the crime scene. For many, it was a bizarre and deeply unsettling outcome. James Saunders, a convicted sex offender, had clearly committed the crime, yet the state still held Billy responsible. The logic behind the conviction hinged on a controversial legal principle that even though Saunders physically carried out the attack, Billy had somehow facilitated it. The sentencing phase followed swiftly. Billy Cope, a man with no previous criminal record, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. James Saunders, who had already committed previous violent crimes, received the same sentence. The courtroom erupted in controversy. Billy's defense team vowed to appeal the conviction, arguing that there was no legitimate evidence connecting him to the crime. They pointed out that he had been convicted based on circumstantial theories, coercive interrogations, and a flawed legal strategy rather than physical proof. Meanwhile, the Cope family was left in complete devastation. Billy had already lost his daughter in the most horrific way imaginable, and now, he was being punished for a crime he insisted he had no part in. His remaining children would grow up without a father. Legal experts and journalists began questioning the validity of the case. Some saw it as a grave miscarriage of justice, a conviction fueled by emotion rather than solid evidence. Others, however, supported the jury's decision, believing that Billy had to have known something. Otherwise, how could such a crime occur in his home without his awareness? Despite the conviction, serious doubts lingered. Investigative reports surfaced highlighting issues with how the case was handled. The long interrogation, the pressure on Billy to confess, and the way the prosecution had crafted a narrative without direct evidence all came under scrutiny. Yet, Billy Cope remained behind bars. His life as a free man was over. His case, however, was far from forgotten. With Billy Cope sentenced to life in prison without parole, his defense team immediately prepared to challenge the verdict. The case had raised serious concerns about whether justice had truly been served. How could Billy be convicted when DNA evidence proved that James Saunders alone had physically committed the crime? The defense argued that Billy had been convicted based on a theory rather than hard evidence. Billy's legal team filed an appeal, citing multiple issues: the lack of forensic proof linking him to the crime, the coercive nature of his interrogation, and the controversial legal strategy used by prosecutors to connect him to Saunders' actions. They pointed out that Billy's confession had been obtained after hours of psychological pressure, at a time when he was a grieving father struggling to understand what had happened. However, despite these arguments, the appellate courts upheld Billy's conviction. Judges ruled that the prosecution's theory, that Billy had either facilitated the crime or created conditions for it to occur, was legally justifiable, even without physical evidence. This decision reinforced the troubling precedent that someone could be convicted based largely on circumstantial interpretation rather than direct proof. Public opinion remained divided. Some believed Billy was guilty, while others saw his conviction as a grave injustice. Legal experts and journalists continued to analyze the case, raising questions about the flaws in the investigation and prosecution strategy. Many pointed out how police tunnel vision and interrogation tactics may have led to a wrongful conviction. Billy, from behind bars, maintained his innocence. He continued to write letters, seeking help from journalists, legal organizations, and anyone willing to re-examine his case. He spoke of Amanda with deep sorrow, insisting that he would never have harmed his daughter or allowed anyone else to. Meanwhile, James Saunders remained in prison, serving his own life sentence. Unlike Billy, there was no doubt about his role. His DNA was at the scene, and his history of violent offenses made him a known predator. Yet Billy was the one who received equal punishment, despite the complete lack of forensic evidence connecting him to the murder. As the years passed, Billy Cope's hope for exoneration faded. His legal team continued to push for appeals, but the justice system moved slowly. In 2017, after spending more than a decade behind bars, Billy died of natural causes in state custody. He never saw freedom again. To this day, the debate over Billy Cope's guilt or innocence continues. Some believe the prosecution's theory was justified, while others argue he was a wrongfully convicted father who suffered not only the loss of his daughter, but also the destruction of his own life. Amanda Cope's murder was a horrifying crime, but the case also serves as a warning about flaws in the justice system, the dangers of coercive interrogations, and the unsettling reality that someone can be convicted based on theory rather than fact. Though Billy Cope is gone, the questions surrounding his case remain unanswered. Whether he was truly guilty or another victim in this tragedy is a debate that may never be fully resolved. What do you feel about this story and the way the case was conducted in court? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to be notified as we add new videos daily. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.